Welcome to Rune Soup, a podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal, coming to you from Land Down Under. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. Enjoy. Today on Rune Soup, we are speaking to Hoodoo and Shamanic practitioner, teacher, and activist Kai Amand. Kai, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, definitely a pleasure. Question number one, traditional first question. Kai, were you a weird kid?
I think I was a weird kid. And I think I used to think I was a weird adult. And I think I've changed my story around that and have begun to tell myself I'm weird in some ways. Weird, I think, has layers to it. Weird is definitely an element of self-perception, a bit of double consciousness. Where does my self-perception intersect with other people's perception of me? I was weird in a different way than I'm weird today. I was weird because I grew up very evangelical Christian. Actually, before evangelical Christian, I was apostolic Christian in my earliest days. So Christianity was a huge part of my identity. I know a lot of people, Christianity was just, something they did. They went to church, they learned some things, maybe they didn't agree. And then, things just sort of faded out. I think for my younger brothers, it's that way. I don't think that it was as fundamental for them as it was for me. In my earliest days, as far back as I can remember, Christianity and the church experience that I was having was so fundamental to my sense of self, my worldview, and that continued right into my adolescence.
And was that something? I mean, was it a fairly Charlie Church sort of family, or were you just kind of like the rigorously Christian kid in your household?
Well, no, it really wasn't. So my parents, they didn't really come into Christianity until I was around 9 or 10. So before that, I was actually going to a small Black apostolic church in Queens, New York, with my grandmother, my aunt and uncle, both of whom were themselves preteens, my aunt and uncle. So they were kind of like older siblings to me. And it was not the kind of church it wasn't Unitarian. Apostolicism is very, very rigid, very fundamentalist. Women, after they've sort of crossed a certain threshold, initiatory in terms of their initiation, don't wear pants anymore. They only wear skirts. We actually had a woman in our apartment building. Many of the people in our church also lived in our apartment building who, if you were a woman, after you quote unquote got saved, she would take all your jeans and she would mend them and turn them into skirts because you were no longer of the world. And getting saved wasn't the sort of jack chick evangelical say this prayer and now, accept Jesus into your heart and now you're saved. Getting saved was actually an ecstatic experience in which during a church service, you are doing something called tarrying. You are repeating the name of Jesus over and over and over again. And you're going to go into a trance. And if you go far enough into that trance, you're just sort of going to fall out, really collapse, really just sort of lose it. And this goes on for many, many hours. If you are one of the people who gets to have this experience, and then you're saved, and then you are no longer of the world, and you really have to act accordingly.
So, did you see all this sort of stuff as a preteen? Like,
I saw all this stuff way before my preteens.
As in, so you'd be a sort of 5-6-year-old in church and watching these people have, falling in the aisle type ecstatic experiences.
Yeah, and it wasn't just sort of falling on the aisle. That's just getting the, quote unquote, getting the spirit.
That's beginner stuff.
Yeah, that's exactly. That's just beginner stuff. We're talking about speaking in tongues and drooling all over yourself, and then a couple of women in white who are ushers having to take you into a back room where you might be there for a couple of hours. And you're just going to be, they're sort of taking you through this process. So it was interesting because for me, very often I was, our church, we had a very broken down van, but we would sort of all pile into it and go to other apostolic churches along the eastern seaboard. And there would be sort of these like late night trips. So I remember, sort of being a very little boy with my head asleep in my grandmother's lap, waiting for a church member at 3 a.m. to come out of the tarrying room so that we could take the trip back from Maryland back to New York.
Interesting. If you look at it from, there are potentially some questions around, exposing kids from a developmental perspective to that kind of stuff. It's presumably traumatic for a very young child to see a parent or an aunt or something. You wonder what it does to their heads to see an aunt essentially become incapacitated and taken to another room for several hours. It's fascinating to look at it from a developmental perspective.
Well, that really wasn't the damaging part. The damaging part was this idea that if I didn't get to go through this initiatory period, or if people like my parents, for instance, who they were not attending the church at the time, they weren't, bad people, they just weren't deeply Christian at the time. If they didn't go through this experience that was pretty localized, it was like, this one church is doing this thing, or this one denomination, then we were all going to hell. So I actually used to just very suddenly cry throughout my childhood in this terror that I was going to hell, that family members that I loved were going to hell. That really was the traumatic piece.
Fascinating. And was it some sort of logical or kind of like, as your child mind is developing, was it? Did you kind of logic yourself out of it, and is that where the Christianity became less rigorous as you hit the adolescence, or did something else kind of intervene at that point?
So around my preteens is when my parents started going to church, but they did not start going to that church. They started going to a non-denominational church. So a church that was far more mainstream America, but evangelical. So not mainstream America as in just Christian, Christmas and Easter were fine with that, but very witnessing. Every Saturday we're going to go to the houses of people in the neighborhood and knock on the doors. It wasn't Jehovah's Witness, but the idea of being saved was that sort of jack chick evangelical, simply say this prayer and now start acting different. And it was around my preteens that my parents started going to a church like that, and they started really questioning the doctrine that I had been immersed in at this other church with my extended family. And that kind of really caused a big family rift because as damaging as those doctrines were, that was the community I had grown up with. And the doctrines that I was now being immersed in with my family made a lot more sense to me. They were, a bit more compassionate, a bit less rigid. Still, obviously, there was a hell. But things definitely shifted a bit. So there wasn't so much a logic piece as much as there was a new teachings piece. Oh, also a much more multicultural experience. We ended up at a church on Long Island in New York that was very, very multi-ethnic, including Latino demographic and Caucasian and African Americans, and actually a very strong Jewish community as well, sort of a Jew for Jesus community.
That's so New York.
Oh my gosh, I can sing so much Hebrew.
All right, cool. That's I think that puts it in the weird category. The other one, I know what you mean about it being a bit self-referential, because I mean, you may also have been an odd kid. Have you always been able to sleep literally anywhere?
Yes, anywhere, especially in cars at night. Very It's like a lullaby.
Well, so when you mentioned the bit about sleeping in the van as a kid, or waiting till 3 a.m., the reason I asked the question, of course, is when earlier this year, when you and I and Langston went out to the West Country, you got in the back of the car and promptly fell fast asleep for the entire journey, and Langston and I sat in the front seats chatting away. And I thought, this is a remarkable talent. I can't sleep anywhere.
I guess really it's just even the day. There's something about the rolling of a car that's just so comfortable for me. I don't know what it is. It's almost impossible for me to stay awake in a car.
There you go. Because I was figuring you might have some kind of weird Japanese skills that sleeping upright on the underground, and because I'm very jealous of that. I can't. I have to drug myself like I'm going in for surgery on long haul flights, and even then it barely works. So I was extremely jealous watching that. But I think it must happen reasonably often because Langston was completely unfazed. He's like, yeah, he just does that. Right, so that's an interesting journey heading into the adolescence. When did you first encounter sort of, shall we say, the magical, in the sense of when did you first encounter operative magic and think this might be something that you would want to follow up on?
Yeah, so part of the weird kid thing was, again, there was tons of kids who went to the church, but they weren't necessarily taking it to heart the way I was. For some reason, it was so important to me. I carried a Bible to school. I mean, literally from elementary school to high school. But it was around high school that I began to come into the fact that I was queer, and that was not sitting well with my family, with people at church. I was a perfect kid, the kid that all the parents were saying, why don't you be like that kid, until that point. And that was when, the bricks started coming out of the wall. And I realized, I went through, tons of depression, etc. But that's when I sort of realized, wait, there's everything else about me is pretty awesome. How is this like the main? Now, how does this sort of get me from an A plus to like a total F, in everyone's eyes? And that was when I started having to, really question everything that I had been told my whole life. And it eventually led me to leaving home and dropping out of high school. And I had actually just seen the play Rent, and it changed my life. It just blew my mind. It gave me a much broader sense of community and who I was in terms of a historical and a recent historical context, people like myself. And it also made me fall in love with the East Village and the idea of the East Village in the 70s and 80s. So I dropped out of high school and I worked at a catering company on Long Island for about a year and saved up enough to move in with a woman in the East Village in Alphabet City. And she is the one who introduced me to operative magic. And at this point, I had gone through a short period of atheism, agnosticism, really wasn't sure what God was at the time. Conversations with God, the book by Neil Donald Walsh, was very, very comforting during that period. And by the time I moved in with her, I was looking for a new job in the city. And I remember her pulling out an old New York, one of those old spell books. When I say those spell books, New York has its own magic history, and there's some notables in it. One of them being Lady Rhea, and she had published a book of carved candle spells some decades earlier. And this woman I moved in with pulled it out and said, "Oh, you're looking for a job and you're having trouble. Why don't you do a spell?" And at that point, I was like, yeah, well, why don't I? I don't believe what I used to believe, and this couldn't be harmful. And I'll never forget going down to enchantments with her and getting some stuff and carving a candle and watching it burn and thinking, oh, this is very pretty, and who knows what will happen. And I will never forget that the day after the candle finished burning, I got an interview, and I got the job. And it was just so peculiar to me. It was just it was the opening, And a few months later, I didn't do much magic before that. In between, I was looking for another job, and I did the exact same spell, and it worked. And exactly the same way. The day after the candle finished burning, I got an interview, and I got the job. And that's forced me to have to look deeper.
That's yeah, I think about that fairly often. There's, especially in the internet age, I think more people at least attempt practical enchantment than we tend to think maybe do. Like I think it's a slim majority experience, but it's the when it works, and they do tend to work quite often in that beginner's luck sense straight away, the reaction is either, this works, I'm never doing it again, or this works, I must find out more.
Yes, foolish mortals.
Yeah. So I guess, especially if there was the beginnings of a kind of identity exploration journey came first, and then you kind of work out magic is a thing, those two things presumably coalesced into your kind of subsequent investigations?
Absolutely, absolutely. Sort of my thought from there, I realized that I had a couple of books that had been given to me years prior that spoke to the subject of matter of magic, but I hadn't cracked them open yet. A few years before this, a friend of mine had just given me her old copy of The Spiral Dance, and for some reason I just never read it. And I was just like, wait, I have this book that's kind of about this. Let me crack it open. And The Spiral Dance by Starhawk. And what that made me realize was, whoa, this isn't just about magic. This is a whole worldview. This is a whole way of seeing everything. The idea of animism, and Starhawk, especially, her weaving together ecology and social justice and gender with responsible magical practice, and the need to engage with these forces on behalf of ourselves and our communities was exactly what I needed. It was, I devoured it, and then I devoured everything else that Starhawk wrote. And when I eventually, got my GED and went to college, it was an ongoing joke that my thesis was going to be becoming Starhawk. Nice. I was going to literally get like plastic surgery and everything, because she was, I just never, she was just sort of my biggest inspiration at the time.
And I mean, remarkable woman, remarkable book. I think there are probably thousands of people out there today that are her fault one way or the other.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
And that being said, I mean, you ended up in Hoodoo. So was that an American magic exploration, or was that bringing in other parts of identity exploration to go, well, hang on, becoming Starhawk is a weirdly problematic thing for like a black queer kid to say in 2016 for a number of reasons. Was that part of it, do you think, as you kind of went into Hoodoo land? Was it purely for an operative magic component, or were there cultural exploration pieces involved?
Well, the cultural exploration pieces definitely happened, but they weren't what I expected. I was fully aware while I was in college. I was like, that they were a little strange for me to be obsessed with this Jewish white woman and her writings on magic, but I didn't have anything. But I felt like I didn't have anything else. I was also really heavily exploring two-spiritedness in American Indian culture. I was also exploring sort of gay archetypal psychology. I went to Hampshire College in Massachusetts, where you don't get a major, you make a concentration, and mine was this combination of theater and ritual anthropology, is what I called it, with a good dose of queer studies, queer mythology. I was trying to understand who queer people were in different cultures, so I could come to an understanding of who I was. So I was looking at a lot of radical fairies. I was looking at Walt Whitman's poetry. I was looking at, I believe his name was Mitch Walker. There was a lot of writing on gay archetypal psychology in the 70s and 80s by a whole host of people. And I was just doing a lot of comparison and contrast and research. And it was around that time that I came across Eddie Gutierrez, the late great Dr. E, who had just founded the Unnamed Path, which was a shamanic tradition, is a shamanic tradition for men who love men. And I found his work, and I was like, oh wow, there's a living Western cosmology that I find really interesting, and it's just coming out. And I began studying that with him. And what was very interesting is, in terms of the magical component, he himself was coming from a Wiccan background, but had just finished some studies with Catherine Ironwood and the Lucky Mojo sort of Hoodoo root work correspondence course, and found himself very empowered by it. Really felt like he had this artillery, and eventually went to open up ConjureDoctor.com, which continues with his living partner Clayton and his mother, who is affectionately known as Mama E. So I was studying the Unnamed Path with him. Didn't really get into hoodoo until after I graduated from Hampshire, and I couldn't find a job. I graduated right into the recession, and I was looking for a job for about a year. And I was living with family again, which was not my cup of tea. But I had this person who I considered to be my teacher, by my first, sort of magical teacher, aside from any books. And I remember, I think I had with him one of my first quote unquote readings ever. And I said, what do I need to do to get a job? What's going on? I really need to move out. And he gave me some remedies, very eagerly gave me some remedies from hoodoo, because that was really what was, the artillery he was packing. And then said at the end of the session, Kai, you really should be doing this. And I was aghast, because I had been doing tarot readings for people at, when I was at school. I had an altar, very neo-Wiccan New Age process, and done rituals for myself. But this was a whole new this was root doctoring. This was a deeper conversation that involved resolving conditions in people's lives. There was a whole terminology around it, a whole culture around it. It was going to force me to have to interface again with Christianity, and that made me nervous. And there was certainly at the time still a sense of Afrophobia for me, which I guess had kept me away from the African diasporic traditions in general for some time. But when he mentioned it to me and said, I'll be your tutor, like, I really think that you have a strong magical gift and a strong counseling gift, and you should be doing this. And I sat on it, and that was, I think, 6 years ago, August 6 years ago. And I created, August 2010. I sat on it, and I created Conjure in the City, which then took me through the next 6 years. And what a journey.
Yeah, it's thinking about it now that I have some of the sort of your hoodoo prehistory story, if you will. It's quintessentially American. The journey, the Kai journey thus far is. It's lots of other things too. It's it's queer and it's Afro-diasporic, but because of those things, it seems like there's a quintessentially American journey going on here, which I think is interesting.
Thank you for saying that. I thank you for saying that, because identity continues to be an interesting conversation for me. A lot of my, for lack of a better word, medicine is about place, and there are a number of places in the world that I have very strong spiritual and cultural ties to. But when you have so many places like that, sometimes you're like, well, am I even a person? Who am I? And America, as I'm sure you know, is really still really struggling with race and ethnicity and value of bodies and beauty. And the term all American is not one that is meant to denote someone like me. Even though I'm having a very American experience, and there was actually a show that was on Broadway some years back, created by a man named Stu, and actually reflects that sort of same conversation. America is such a unique place in terms of its refusal to look at itself. But the show is called Passing Strange, and it's actually about a young black man who's growing up in L.A. and a Christian church in L.A. and ends up leaving the church and going to sort of find himself abroad in Germany. And the guy who wrote it, Stu, he wrote it when he found out that George Bush Jr. Or whatever he is, had never, he had all this privilege and all this money and access to, private jets and stuff, and never left the USA before his 20s, or possibly even like before his president, something absurd like that. And he was like, who is this person who felt this entitlement to have so much power in the world, but yet never even dared to look at it? When I was that age, I desperately needed to find myself through the lens of the world, and that's an American story. So yeah, it's interesting for you to use that term, and I don't even think many Americans would have that sort of insight that you just had.
Well, I'm foreign, so you all look like foreign weirdos to me. But I think, yeah. But I think there's this, a varying church experience at, a young age. There's engagement with, for better or for worse, there's engagement with the land via something like spiral dance. And the two-spirit stuff is literally indigenous magic. And then you end up in Hoodoo, which is, quintessentially American. But on that, I mean, what even is Hoodoo, Kai? What's a good definition of it?
So the definition I usually go by with Hoodoo is that it is Black American folk magic practices from the American South that are the originating in Congo traditions, especially from West Africa, and rooted in the Protestant Black American experience.
I like that.
So
yeah, keep going.
Sorry. So most people, when you say Hoodoo, the first things you have to do is begin to, people who've never heard of it, begin to delineate it and note the differences between Hoodoo and even New Orleans voodoo. And that is an important distinction for me, because I did not grow up Catholic. And in fact, I grew up in the Jack Chick world of Christian conspiracyism.
Yeah, fairly anti-papist, yes.
Oh, gosh, yes, the Whore of Babylon. And, New Orleans voodoo, this idea of, all these saints, and then, for some, even the Orishas, and adopting saints in my own Hoodoo practice was actually exciting. I definitely did move in that direction, but the conversation of what was happening east of the Mississippi was closer to my own experience of singular God, singular Jesus, singular Holy Ghost, the Bible, strong prayer, anointing oil, the simplicity of that. It's almost like that, the Catholicism aspect it spoke to my heart, and it continues to speak to my heart, but the east of the Mississippi conversation that was more Protestant spoke to my roots.
I like that. Yeah. I think we had this discussion in London that it's because it is so syncretic, because it is a practice rooted in the real challenges of people's day-to-day lives. It was inevitably going to kind of magpie pick up the saints on its later journey, but it doesn't originate within it. It originates as that it would use herb lore and candles and prayer and the such you said, but because these other components work and fit naturally into that syncretic ecosystem, it seems an almost inevitability, like a Hoodoo isn't a museum piece, put it that way.
Yes, agreed.
So, kind of on that then, if you're talking about a journey through hoodoo, and you characterized it as, you know, a originating with Black America in the South. What it also subsequently picked up, you know, Jewish components. It subsequently picked up indigenous American components. I mean, let's talk about the journey from its origin point to the delicious hot mess that it went on to become.
Yes, which is such a delicious hot mess. And I think one of the best, one of the most beautiful things about that delicious hot mess is the art we get out of it. I much like the the wonderful and semi-infamous Catherine Ironwood of Lucky Mojo. Of Lucky Mojo Curio Company in Forestville, California. I am also a great lover of the advertising of what Katrina Hazard Donald would call marketeered hoodoo. Now, you know, it's unfortunate because, you know, at that time, we are talking about, you know, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, we are talking about a severe watering down of hoodoo practices and traditions through corporatization. But at the same time, we're also talking about a popularization and Americanization. You know, we're talking about something entering into the American art arcana and curio arcana at that time. But leading up to that, yeah, we have you know, African peoples who don't have access to the herbs and plants and animals that they're used to. So they're working with indigenous peoples and asking, you know, what's good for this, or what would you use for that. We have Jewish doctors and pharmacists in Black communities because they're not allowed to practice in Anglo-Saxon communities. And they have African Americans coming in and asking for certain plants or roots that they don't have. But they say, you know what, you might consider this. And we have we have incense and colored candles coming in from Judaism. And in both New York and San Francisco, we have an influx of Chinese pharmacists bringing in such plants as the bat nut and Buddha into hoodoo lore and practices. Not to mention the Pennsylvania Dutch. So yeah, there's this amalgamation that happens that is just, I think, beautiful. And there are some people who really struggle with it and really are attached to sort of traditionalist story about hoodoo, but hoodoo itself is a story of whatever works, use it, because we don't got much.
Well, I mean, that it was kind of going to be the next question. I adore the marketeering as well. I love the fake old timey names. It's beautiful, and this is what I mean. Again, it's quintessentially American. It does, however, have the an origin point in Black American experience, and then over a 120-year period became about quote unquote America. So, for how is that navigated for you know? This is an opinion question. Obviously, it's not really a thing we can solve. But how does that get navigated in the 21st century if you come from a non-Black background? The things that I'll put a few things out there and see what you think about them. I think acknowledging the syncretic story you mentioned, the Jewish pharmacy component, the Chinese, etc., allows access in a certain way. But I think there's a piece, because underlying the explosion of hoodoo in the 20s is the scary side of it is you don't start marketing a product unless there's a need for it. And so there are all these, enchantments and oils and spells out there that are designed to do things like ensure you have a fair trial and stuff that kind of hints at a fairly unpleasant time, frankly. And that's the bit that I like. How do we navigate that piece if we're coming into it in a more if it wants to have multi-ethnic conversations? I think it's starting with the syncretic piece is the way in, but I'm unclear as to how to navigate the fact that hoodoo exists because it works, and it works because there were things that needed to be worked. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And we have to say that hoodoo root work is grounded in the lived experience of Black American Protestants in the South. We have to say that, and I do, even though I am excited about people practicing hoodoo. In fact, I think that hoodoo is almost, there's a prophetic quality to it. There's a prophetic quality to it that surpasses. It's bigger than than the sum of its parts. Because what happens is that people come into hoodoo because of its practicality. People of all ethnicities, and then it leads them back to the traditions. It quite often, not all the time, but it very often leads them back to the traditions of their own ancestors. But it's because they began with this very practical magic, and then they start thinking about, oh well, grandma, who everyone thought was a kook, she did have, Guru Raja on her wall, and maybe that's the person who visited me in the dream. And I'm going to, maybe mix some of my spirit guide oil, and put that on his image, and this sort of stepping stone back because Black people were resilient and holding on to this tradition. It opened the way for people in the 21st century to find their way back to traditions that had been forgotten or displaced further back, or even recently. That's part of it's like the coming to America and losing one's accent, getting rid of those old folk customs. And the other thing is that I do get upset when people who are white and have online shops or shops, what they're doing is clearly hoodoo, and the products they're selling are clearly hoodoo, and the spells that they offer on their website are clearly hoodoo, and they don't say anything about where this grounding is from, where these spells are coming from. Because in my own experience of popular European witchcraft, I'm not talking about cunning magic. I'm not talking about root doctoring or stregoria in a community doctoring sense, but I want a love spell, or I'm just going to do a banishing ritual. None of these contexts has the level of practicality and specificity and diagnosis that root work has. That root work has and maintained that you are in this condition, and we are going to turn this condition around to ensure that you are in a new, blessed, upright, and holy, and receiving all that is good condition. None of these other traditions that are sort of popular, coming from other places, and are as accessible, are coming from that. So we have to say where this is coming from, because what it's given us is so good.
See, I think that's an extremely astute observation, and it's kind of the two things you just said are sort of two sides of the same coin, which is hoodoo kind of in the 21st century is a little bit of a trap for the sincere seeker, where if they come at it from a non-black ethnic background, if they take it seriously enough, two things happen, which is a realization that it maps to a specifically black experience over the late 19th through 20th century, or before, but you know what I mean. It maps to a black American experience, which they don't map to. So they go and say, well, what do I map to? And it kind of is it tricks them into authenticity. And that is because I don't, I agree with you. I get queasy when you look at, non-black online stores that are patently hoodoo. I get queasy for different reasons than you, obviously, but I get queasy because there's an inauthenticity to this that I'm not resonating with, and maybe it's that the hoodoo trick hasn't worked on them enough yet. But that's, I think, a fascinating insight. If you're doing it right, it does need to be informed by identity at some point.
Yes, and it's going to lead you back to yourself if you're doing it right. And I want to make it very explicit. I know incredible white hoodoo root doctors, and white hoodoo root doctors have existed as far back, if not earlier, than the 1800s. So it's, for me, it's not about white people not practicing hoodoo. In no way is it about that. But it's about owning your shit and saying where things come from. I mean, there's elements of my practice that are very that smell and look a lot like curanderismo, or certain Latin American traditions, and I try to be extremely blunt about where I've been, where I haven't been, and simply certain things are practices of the heart, and certain things are certain things that my spirits have led me to. But I feel like we're having a conversation about America and identity. I mean, one of the questions I've been having has been, I can't scroll through my Facebook feed for more than 5 minutes without seeing about 30 posts of people really boasting how witchy they are, and I've sort of been in this place, especially as I've delved more into a shamanic worldview of, are you a witch or are you just an American with who feels disempowered and has identity issues? It's
this is
from a shamanic.
Yeah, this is the authenticity question, because I agree completely that a black tradition is invitational to non-black ethnicities in the same way any ethnicity is available, like any ethnic tradition is available, if your story is honored and the story of that particular thing is honored at the same time. And that's where you can unfortunately find the sort of authenticity gaps online. And what you just said about witchcraft is one of them. It's like, are you playing dress up? Are the wires plugged into the wall in what you're talking about on the internet?
You took the words right out of my mouth. For me, that authenticity thing happened. I mean, my conversation, because I didn't grow up in the American South. I do have, as I was practicing hoodoo, I did come across some very interesting family stories related to hoodoo. When I bring them up to my family, because they say it to me as just an interesting story, and all of a sudden I have 3 books that I'm telling them they should read, and I'm like, this is what I'm doing, and they're like, we don't know what you're talking about, we're just giving you a little anecdote from the 1970s. But my own authenticity around that sort of just happened with Conjure in the City. I didn't want to play. I learned this from my Georgian granny, and this is the most down-home folk stuff you've ever heard of. I New York, born and raised, and to me, the city has always been a very magical place. I mean, in a city of 8 million people, energy travels very quickly. If you are experiencing crossed conditions, you'll know within 48 hours because your MTA card isn't going to slide through quick enough, and you're just going to miss the train. It's going to close right before you get downstairs, and then someone's going to spit in your mouth, and then when you finally get on the train car, it's the car that no one's in, and you think, great, I get to have a seat, but someone shat in it. You're going to know very quickly that you're under crossed conditions. And if you are in a state of blessedness and great cross conditions, you're running into someone you haven't seen in a long time who, has that job connection for you on the street, and then you find out that there's some free food on the next block, and then you find 20. It's that, to me, was magic, and I was like, well, that's my context for this.
Well, I mean, this is why I think your story is very American and very New York, because if you're going to find places on Earth that have for the most part, get optionality and multi-ethnicity and so on to work in a way that is like unto nothing else in human history, where else but New York?
Yeah, really. Very much, very true.
So when we talk about authenticity, and I'm going to move it into kind of I guess I would call this a dangerous but necessary territory of umbrella terms. But if we look at something like the modern conception of shamanism, to my mind, it has a high degree of overlap with an authentic practice of something like hoodoo or root work, particularly around concepts such as helping spirits. So, Kai, who are the helping spirits?
Okay, so my term for helping spirits, gosh, I kind of put helping spirits in two separate categories, and the categories themselves are very blurry. On one hand, but I make the distinction because there's a real consumerist attitude in the magical community around spirits, and it makes me a little sad. I understand why it's there. Spirits, the idea of spirits, at least, is very cool and interesting, and got to catch them all. On the other hand, there's an issue of alignment with who you are and what you came here to do, and that there are spirits who, possibly you're drawn to them, possibly they're drawn to you because of affinity. Saints, goetic demons, whatnot, and so on. But then there are those spirits that are actually directly tied to you, who actually, when you chose to incarnate, they said, "Fabulous idea. Let's do this. Love what you're going to do. I'm going to be the costume designer, and I'm going to be the stage manager, and I'm going to take. We're going to take these roles, and we're going to reflect the magic that you're carrying in this lifetime, and be with you." And that idea has been retained in certain African diasporic traditions like Santeria and Vodou and Kimbanda, all of which have this idea of your spiritual court. You're going to have these spirits that are cosmology specific that are also reflecting you. Oshun, an Oshun person, someone who has Oshun as their head and Santeria, is a different person than someone who has Shango as their head. Someone who's Metet in Vodou is Urzuli Freda is a different person than someone who's Metet is the spirit Urzuli Danto. Both, those two spirits are very much at odds in a way in the tradition. So those are kept and maintained. But from a shamanic perspective, and when I say shamanic, for myself, I mean the root of everything. As far as I understand today, because tomorrow I'll find out more about, that root gets thicker and broader every day. There are even more spirits than that cosmology that are tied to you. There's animal helping spirits. There's your ancestors. There's, and I actually do these sessions. I do these mediumship sessions in which I am asking my own helping spirits and the person's helping spirits for 4 or 5. Who are the spirits who are most closely walking with this person? And I do it from a very non-cosmological standpoint. Now, sometimes some spirits creep in who are tied to specific cosmologies. And if those are cosmologies that I don't have license to speak on, I will simply say, you know what, this is smelling a lot like this entity. I will describe them to you. And now I'm going to refer you to someone who can probably help you work that out more concretely. But very often the 4 or 5 spirits are a conglomeration of ancestral helping spirits, animal helping spirits, non-terrestrial helping spirits. I've had popes show up. Spirits that, are not tied to you have to have gone through this initiation, but are still saying, I am this reflection of you, and if you only knew that I was working alongside you and reflecting this part of you, and it's awe-inspiring. And I don't say that in any way to flatter myself. I am in as much awe, if not more, at the end of every session than the person I'm, on the phone with or sitting across from, because my mind is just blown away by the genius of it all. I've had helping spirits step forward that were the past life version of the person in front of me. who has chosen to walk with them in this lifetime to help them do what they've come here to do. And it's rather than pick and choose a spirit for a spell, we're really talking about these spirits that are tied to soul's purpose. So helping spirits are all spirits that are helpful, but for me, I prefer to use the term when I'm talking about those spirits that are especially tied to help you do what you came here to do and be the person you came here to be.
Right, so that relationship exists within or those relationships exist within a kind of wider, and I think this is where I was looking for the overlap between something like hoodoo and the sort of dangerous umbrella term of shamanism, but we, with the caveats of where that term comes from and how it's been used, we know what we're talking about. And I think it's these relationships exist within a context of a spirit world or a spirit ecosystem, and helping spirits are ones that are specific to you and what you're going to do in this particular incarnation, but they're in a much wider constellation of spirit world.
Yeah, and sometimes they will lead you to a cosmology or tradition that they are, if they are coming from a specific one and one that it really serves you to look into. I mean, it happens maybe 30% of those kinds of sessions I do. I say, oh, this is absolutely, something, a spirit coming from Santeria, but I'm not a Santero, so I can't say that. I'm going to say this is smelling like this, and I'm going to give you a referral, just because I know what the energy of that tradition is looking like. And a part of me even looks at the spirit and says, you should. And they say, whatever, someone had to tell him. And again, I'm not telling that person, I know Elegua is your head spirit. I'm saying there is someone here who is very Elegua-like, and I'm getting all of this information that is even more adding to that and their role in your life. And here's the name of a Santero who can, confirm that or help you look in a direction that's going to, really bring clarity to what this energy is about.
Right. So when you describe shamanism as a route, we could also describe it as the widest possible map you found so far. Yes. Because it allows that kind of interoperability and also I think, and this is a bit that I think is one of its core utilities is to be able to navigate those spirit / respect / ethnic divides where you don't say, okay, that smells like Elegua, so my corollary of Elegua in this cosmology is this, so I'm going to say that. It gives you a map to kind of go, I know what I know and I know what I don't know. This is what I think it is, and go over there. And that map is, I think, very 21st century useful.
It so is, because a lot of damage can happen. We are in if we are in a very unique position in history, and we are very globalist, and so are the spirits. They are, the Orishas love Chinese food. It's. I live in New York. It's all coming together. So I get cosmology specific. There are people who are meant to work in a specific cosmology, but I believe it's a great disservice to believe that the entire world is operating that cosmology. When I went through shaman sickness some years back, there was a water spirit that was leading me through this initiatory experience, and it was not a water spirit that I had ever heard of. And had I gone to, 90% of practitioners of the African diasporic traditions in New York, they would have told me that water spirit, probably was the water spirit that they knew of, and it was not. This was not a water spirit that is really well known, and I had to do a lot of research and have a lot of strange signs show up to finally find out who was doing this crazy thing to me, because it wasn't Yemaya, and it wasn't Olokun, and it wasn't Laseden. And if if I had gone beyond, if certain, say, technologies had been applied to my body and spirit, I could have been really fucked up,
So that's, I mean, in my head, I just went to how, not that I diagnose or anything, but in my head, I just went to, if you had if you're having a negative water spirit experience, during a shaman sickness, this is a fairly good example of the interoperability that I think comes from this wider map worldview. Because in my head, I just went to of the four kings, Paimon has dominion over the ocean and all the things in it. So I immediately went to, well, that's what I would do. I would go and find the kind of water/ocean king within within that tradition, and it may not have been a match, but it's I think the fact that we can have these discussions with the context of a wider map is very 2016. It does allow for an increasing level of precision with this kind of work.
Absolutely. It really does. And the nuance that I've found in my client work has been really, really interesting. Because not all spirits, even spirits who appear to be helpful, are helpful, and not all spirits that we revere are healthy, even. Not just healthy for us, but just healthy. I mean, the spirit that I'm talking about, she was certainly a powerful energy that took me through that initiatory process, but in the end, was not healthy herself, and was not a spirit that I could continue working with and remain true to myself or sane, frankly. So there's a whole host of other conversations that come up around not just technologies that have been lost, but a certain sense of discernment that has been lost as things have gotten more global and bigger in some ways, and yet in some ways also far more watered down and elemental or elementary.
Right. So, I mean, we're going to talk about your kind of shamanic journey now, and you said something that may have answered the question for me, which is, did the kind of increasing resonance with this sort of modern conception of shamanism as the most authentic and effective way of kind of being in multiple worlds, did that emerge out of the Hoodoo worldview, or did it emerge out of the Hoodoo client work?
That emerged out of both, actually. There were certain energies, early in my Hoodoo practice that other Hoodoo practitioners were working with that I felt tremendous resonance with, and I sort of knew I have to go get a statue of that person right now and walk that road. San Simon Mashimon of Guatemala being a perfect example. Now, I've never been to Guatemala, nor have I met or worked with a practitioner who is, an indigenous practitioner who knows this energy. I do as much research as I can. I try to honor this entity with my heart and as best I can, but I'm not going to write a book on him because I don't know him from his origins. So there's that piece, just sort of affinity and what I've been drawn to. The other piece has been experiences. So during my shaman sickness, while I was being taken through this situation by a West African water spirit that falls under the umbrella of Mamiwata spirits. But that wasn't her name. That's not her name. There were other little pieces that were very strange. I had a very intense visionary experience that my soul knew to be, these are Mongolian spirits. These are queer Mongolian spirits, and they are spiritually having sex with me right now while telling me, you are a shaman, and we're taking you through this experience. Accept what you are. And it was one of those. You are never going to forget this, and this will be something undeniable visionary experiences. And I had to come to, it took me a couple of years, but I finally did go to someone of North Asian heritage and say, this thing happened to me. I haven't, a couple of years ago, that was very fundamental to my shaman sickness. I don't have any words for it. Did I just make this up and get divination from them that was, oh, no, 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 no. You did not just make this up. And then Langston has to deal with me waking up in the middle of the night and saying, there's someone here. Who's here? It's an Islamic dude. Why is he here? Because I worked with him in a past life and helped him out, and now he wants me to be reading the Quran every day. I'm privileged in a way to be having an absurdly global experience. And I mean absurd with a capital A, and a global with a capital G. But it is definitely a tightrope. It's definitely a tightrope, because I can only claim my experiences by virtue of them being capital E experiences, whether they be my own waking or nighttime visions or something I had to intersect with a client.
Interesting. I like that. But it sort of comes back to the where the overlap is that is the tension between the embodied experience, which you can find so. One of the things that fascinates me, for instance, is High-John as a plant spirit. Now, that's hoodoo to the core, but it is also shamanism to the core, and it's a reasonably good example of one of those spirits on a mission, like ayahuasca and so on. For instance, I have it's not planting season for them, but I have an organic seed supplier in Queensland here in Australia that sells High-John seeds. So they sell them for flowers, and they acknowledge that it's an important component of hoodoo and so on. But that means there are gardens, like organic gardeners in Australia, growing the spirit because they know they may not be, digging up the roots, but this seems to be a thing that the High-John spirit did. It's like, I would like to adorn the gardens of a desert continent now, and that sort of way of having those conversations in a physical and non-physical way seems to me like where the overlap is between something like hoodoo and shamanism.
Well, folk, and that's the thing for me. Folk magic is shamanic for sure. Even these traditions are shamanic, and what I believe and what I've been exploring a lot is that there are untold mysteries and information that are available to us if we go deeper. Go deeper and learn to ask the right questions. Where to me that definitely also shows up in the idea of regional hoodoo, hoodoo that in Virginia looking different from hoodoo in Georgia. But of course, being both hoodoo and certain plant spirits being anthropomorphized and having certain missions. And I think that goes back to, again, hoodoo being bigger than the sum of its parts, hoodoo being something that people were resiliently carrying, and they were carrying it for themselves, they were carrying it for their children and their children's children, but some energy in the universe knew that they were also carrying it because in 2015, a young Indian woman was going to lose her lover and find a hoodoo root doctor, and through that avenue was going to tap into her own psychic gifts and start practicing hoodoo, and then find her way into something that worked for her and spoke to her.
Absolutely, it is a outer covering on a seed that re-enchants the world, and I use that metaphor to kind of, because growing up, and it was probably, technically I would consider it appropriative now, but as a young kid, like late 80s, early 90s, pre-internet, trying to find practical magical stuff in regional Australia, I'd hear about things like High-John and couldn't get it, but if I could, I probably would have used it, and I probably would have used it in an accidentally appropriative way. I certainly wouldn't have meant it as such, but the reality is it would have been. Now I live in an old 19th century churchyard. If/when I plant these high John seeds, it's not going to be. It's going to be part of that mission, and I quite like the idea that a hoodoo folk spirit is now growing in a 19th century churchyard in Australia, and I can just leave them here when I leave.
Absolutely.
And that's brilliant, you know. So how do we cohere this? I mean, what have you got? How have you cohered this? What's going on?
So what's going on is that the world is far more interesting than any of us know. And any one of us who thinks that we've got the whole thing is dead wrong, and we have to be in a constant state of openness and awe and discernment, preferably working with, I would say, those helping spirits that are closest to us. And if you don't know who they are, you can, definitely find out. There's people who do divination of that sort. There's also I find trance. I do a lot of trance work. Trance is one of my primary forms of divination, even before tarot. And learning how to work effectively with trance states to interact with those energies that are closest to you. And we've got to move forward, not tiptoeing. We got to move forward boldly, but with discernment. And we've got to move forward with like we're on a mission, because we really are individually on a mission. We are. The state of our world is really terrifying. The idea of leadership is almost rubble, and the people who have become leaders in our world often don't deserve the title, don't deserve to be leaders, and perhaps they could have been good leaders for us, but they are people who did not have the tools or context to be the people who they came here to be and who we needed them to be. Hurt people.
So what's the solve for that? What's impact shamanism? Permit me to interrupt myself there, Gordon. As you probably know by now, if this isn't your first episode, what tends to happen when you start talking about spirit work is, of course, you get Skype gremlins. So, and in perfect timing, it happens just as Kai is talking about the project that he's going on with. So I've tried to clean it up as much as possible, but there's a little bit of static. So you can still make out what Kai is talking about, but just listen a little bit more carefully, and apologies.
So impact shamanism is it's my response to my own practice. Conjuring the City, I closed in August, and impact shamanism is me realizing that I was most excited about being available for people who knew that they were on a mission, whether they were on an artistic mission or on a mission toward being a leader or opening a business or opening a company or a small storefront, or they're a scholar. It really applies to everyone, but not everyone is aware that they have a soul's purpose. Not everyone is aware of the calling on their lives, or that nagging sense that there's more to themselves. And some people don't want to be aware of that. Some people, you tell them that and they say, yeah, but no thanks. We don't have a culture that is fostering health, let alone resources, for us to do what we've come here to do. So we're incarnating into this world with these great ideas and great missions and great gifts, and then finding this world beating the shit out of us and sucking us dry, and finding ourselves in chronological adulthood wondering where we lost our way, and hoping to just survive pretty much into old age and not have everything taken away from us. And there's a better answer there. I do still love doing conjure work, and again, conjure and folk magic to me are shamanic. They are a part of what I will be offering through Impact Shamanism. They are even more so a part of what I'll be doing through Greenwood Conjure, which is a collaboration between myself, Langston Kahn, and Paige Zafariou of Tarot and Tea. Paige Zafariou is of Tarot and Tea. Langston Kahn is of Occupy Your Heart. And we're all located in Brooklyn, actually in an area called Greenwood Heights. And we all have our own witchcraft and root doctoring backgrounds and practice. We decided to combine them together in Greenwood Conjure. But then we also have, each of us has a piece that we are doing on our own that's really speaking very strongly to a sense of I guess, larger mission. And for me, that is me creating Impact Shamanism, which is every day revealing itself to be even bigger than I know it is and bigger than I understand. And it's really exciting to be working with something that wants to come into the world through me and possibly through others that hasn't been seen before and is bigger than I can even fully imagine. One of the inspirations of Impact Shamanism is, frankly, the sort of tech startup industry in the United States, because that has become almost like a salvation call for people in my generation. You're in your 20s, you graduated college possibly into a really horrible economy, but we have told ourselves that scientism and technology will mend all wounds, so you must learn coding. And your soul's purpose has probably been to create a really, really awesome app. So much advertising is going into motivation around technology and startup companies and the idea of Impact Shamanism, to sort of borrow from that, is that your soul is cutting edge. What you actually came here to do, whether or not our culture is making it easy for you to do it, whether or not the trauma of your childhood is blurring the lines for you, your original code and who you came here to be, that thing that was going to bring you and is still going to bring you greater joy than anything else, is cutting edge and so desperately needed in this world. Let's figure and help you do it. Let's from a using shamanic tools, intuitive tools, spiritual tools to sort of bring healing, to help you identify who your allies are in the world and in the main world. Folk magic is always excellent for helping us cut away the dross and open roads and enlightenment. So I'm really excited about this convention that really speaks to my heart around resourcing and empowering people who know themselves to be creatives, leaders, and visionaries, and know that they need more than just a really cool meme that tells them not to give up.
It does. I hope I can clean this up in the recording, but some of that we're getting a little bit of chop going on in the recording.
Oh, sorry about that.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it was you. I mean, these sort of things tend to happen with these kind of discussions. But in many ways, it might just be a little nudge that I think I've taken up too much of your time, Kai. So, so if people who want to know more about Impact Shamanism, obviously, where do they go and what's coming up?
So yeah, they can go to impactshamanism.com, or they can find us on Facebook. And if they they can also find greenwoodconjure.com and also find Greenwood Conjure on Facebook. And the project that's sort of coming out of both of them is an upcoming course online on plant spirit shamanism that's really going to combine those conversations that we were just having for toward the end of this conversation.
See, I think that's where one of the exciting overlaps is how we look at how we reposition things like herbalism and plant lore and plant magic with this new idea of the wider map of shamanism or that kind of thing. I think it's exciting times.
There's a lot of fun to be had.
There is. Well, Kai, obviously for everyone listening, this will all be in the show notes, of course. But Kai, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's been great chatting. And that's how you put out a topical podcast without talking about the topic. Spirit work, activism, the assumption or even seizure of sorely needed leadership roles within communities, the inextricability of magic and culture, it's all in there. As for the audio challenges towards the end, well, the same thing happened with my discussion with Langston. So I'm not saying they have mad skills or anything, but Skype definitely hates their apartment, and the Cyprian amulet I bought from Kai all those years ago is still going strong. Just putting that out there. Anyway, check out the show notes for more about impact shamanism or greenwood conjure. Subscribe to the show in iTunes or your favorite podcatcher. Head over to runesoup.com to sign up for the newsletter and the video Q&A. Let me know your thoughts on the RuneSoup Facebook page. And find me on Twitter, where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.